In 1896, a 16-year-old boy in the town of Madurai in South India sat alone in a room and had an experience he spent the rest of his life trying to describe. He had been, until that afternoon, an ordinary schoolboy, not particularly religious, not especially philosophical, not the kind of person that the biographies of spiritual teachers usually begin with, the child drawn early toward the sacred, the sensitive soul who always felt different from the world around them. He was lying on the floor. A sudden, overwhelming fear had seized him, the conviction that he was about to die. He lay still and let it come, did not call out, did not run to a doctor, did not do any of the things that the ordinary response to the fear of dying produces. He lay still, and he asked himself a question. If I die, what is it that dies? What is this I that fears its ending? What is the self that is afraid? He held the question, not philosophically, not as an intellectual exercise, as a direct investigation. And what happened in the minutes that followed, in the specific, unrepeatable, completely undramatic room in which a schoolboy was lying on a floor, was that something shifted. The fear dissolved, not because the question was answered in words, because the investigating, the act of turning the attention back toward itself, of asking who was afraid rather than what was feared, led the attention to something that was not afraid, something that was present and aware, and had always been present and aware, and was not the object of any threat, because it was not an object at all. He spent the next 54 years sitting in the presence of that discovery, teaching, mostly through silence, occasionally through direct dialogue, the practice he had stumbled into on that floor in Madurai. He called it Atma Vichara, self-inquiry, and the whole of it is contained in one question. Who am I? There's a specific kind of exhaustion that most people in midlife recognize immediately when it is named, the exhaustion of the self that has been performing. Not dishonestly, not the exhaustion of someone pretending to be something they are not, the exhaustion of a self that has been very actively being something, maintaining the identity, keeping the story of who you are consistent across the professional and personal and social contexts that each require a slightly different version.
The career self, the parent self, the partner self, the colleague self, the person you are at dinner parties and the person you are when you wake at 3 in the morning and the person you are in the car alone. The accumulated performance, mostly genuine, mostly good, but tiring, always tiring. Because performance, however sincere, requires the maintenance of a distance between the performer and what they are performing. And somewhere in that distance, in the gap between the performing self and the witnessing self, between who you have become in the world's eyes and who is quietly watching that becoming, something has been waiting. Something that is not tired, something that was present before the performance began, something that, in the moments when the performing stops, in the early morning, in the deep quiet, in the specific quality of a sunset or a piece of music that arrived before the mind could position itself toward it, is simply here, without effort, without maintenance, without the exhausting work of being anything in particular. Ramana Maharshi spent 54 years pointing at that, not as a theological claim, as a direct, practical, completely available invitation to look, right now, without going anywhere, without achieving anything, at who is looking. Venkataraman Iyer, who would eventually be known as Ramana Maharshi, the word Maharshi meaning great sage, was born in 1879 in Tamil Nadu. After the death experience in 1896, he left his family without explanation and traveled to the holy mountain of Arunachala in Tiruvannamalai. He stayed for the rest of his life, 54 years. The mountain, in the Hindu tradition, is considered a manifestation of Shiva, of consciousness itself. Ramana identified with it completely and described it not as a place he had chosen, but as a place that had chosen him, that had called him across 100 miles with a pull he could not explain and did not try to. He lived initially in the mountain's caves, in silence, in the specific austerity of a person who had found what he was looking for and had no need of anything the world outside was offering. Local people began to gather around him, not because he was teaching in any organized sense, he was barely speaking, but because the quality of his presence was palpable to the people who came near it. They sat with him. Some of them found in the sitting something they had been looking for in other places. Over decades, a formal ashram grew at the base of the mountain. Teachers from across the world came, Westerners, Indian philosophers, seekers from every tradition. Paul Brunton, whose book A Search in Secret India brought Ramana to Western attention in the 1930s, described meeting him and finding, in a man who spoke rarely, who answered questions mostly with silence or with counter-questions, the most complete sense of peace he had encountered in any human being. Ramana died in 1950 of a tumor on his arm. When his students wept and asked him not to leave them, he said, "But where would I go? The awareness that I am does not go anywhere. Where do you think I could go?" The practice he taught, self-inquiry, Atma Vichara, is the simplest and the most demanding practice in the Indian philosophical tradition.
The instruction is this: when a thought arises, any thought, any feeling, any perception, any experience, instead of following the thought outward to its content, trace it back to its source. Ask, to whom does this thought arise? Who is thinking this? Who is experiencing this? The answer, the habitual, automatic, completely unreflective answer is, I am. I am thinking. I am experiencing. I am worried. I am happy. I am uncertain. And then the question goes deeper. But what is this I? Where does it come from? Can you locate it? Can you find it as an object? The way you can find a thought, a feeling, a sensation. Can you point to it with the attention that is trying to find it? What Ramana reported, what his students reported, what the Upanishadic tradition that informed his practice had been reporting for 3,000 years, is that the I, pursued to its source, cannot be found as an object, because it is the subject, because it is the awareness that is doing the looking, and awareness cannot see itself as a thing for the same reason that the I cannot see itself seeing. But something happens in the looking, in the turning of the attention back toward its source, in the moment of genuine inquiry before the mind fills the space with an answer. The grasping stops, briefly. The performing stops, briefly. And what is present in that stopping, what was always present underneath the performing and the grasping and the very busy work of being a self, becomes, briefly, visible. Ramana gave very few formal teachings. He wrote almost nothing. The texts attributed to him are mostly transcribed dialogues and reported conversations. What he left behind was not a system, but an invitation. He said, the question, who am I, is not really a question at all. It is a pointer. It is meant to direct the attention to the questioner rather than to any possible answer. Because any answer, any conceptual, linguistic, biographical answer is not what you are. It is something you know about yourself, something you have, not the knowing itself, not the knowing itself. This is the distinction that the inquiry is designed to produce. Between everything you know about yourself, the name, the history, the accumulated identity, the story of a particular person moving through a particular world, and the awareness that knows it, the knower, the silent, unchanged, always already present awareness that has been here since before the story began and will be here when this particular version of the story ends. He pointed at this not as a theological doctrine, but as a direct, immediately available fact of experience, something you can verify, something you can find, not by going somewhere or achieving something, but by stopping right now and asking, who is stopping? The philosopher Paul Brunton described an encounter with Ramana that I want to stay with because it captures something that the doctrinal account of the teaching cannot quite transmit.
Brunton arrived at the ashram expecting the kind of spiritual teacher he had encountered elsewhere in India, one who would speak, teach, explain, give him something to carry away. He was prepared with questions, had been preparing them for weeks. Ramana looked at him, did not speak. Brunton's prepared questions dissolved. His thinking slowed. The ordinary mental activity, the planning, the processing, the continuous inner commentary, stilled in a way it had not stilled in years. He sat in the hall. He did not know how long he sat. He wrote later, "Something that had never happened to me before occurred. I found myself becoming more and more quiet, more and more calm. My thoughts were not exactly arrested, but they slowed down, and their weight seemed to diminish. A sense of inner ease pervaded me." Inner ease. Not the achievement of anything, not the arrival at an answer, the temporary cessation of the performing, the brief, genuine, completely available rest in the awareness that does not need to be anything to be fully what it is. Brunton had traveled across India looking for something. He found it in a hall where no one was speaking, in the presence of a man who had learned over 50 years to simply rest in what was already there. Now the bridge. Because Ramana Maharshi was a spiritual teacher in the Hindu tradition, working within a specific cultural and religious context that most of the people watching this video do not inhabit. But the question he taught, "Who am I?" does not require that context. It requires only the one thing that every human being already has: awareness. The awareness that is present right now, receiving these words, that has been present, uninterrupted, unchanged in its fundamental quality, through every experience this person has ever had, through sleep and waking, through joy and grief, through the various versions of the self that the decades have produced. The question is an invitation to look at that, not to conceptualize it, not to arrive at a philosophical position about it, to look directly, right now, with the specific quality of attention that asks not what I know about myself, but what the self is that is doing the knowing. You do not have to go to India. You do not have to sit in silence for 50 years. You have to be willing, for one breath, for one moment of genuine inquiry, to turn the attention around, to stop looking outward at the contents of the experience and ask instead, what is the awareness that the experience is arising in? The question is the practice. The practice is the question, and it is available right now in the only place it has ever been available, in the awareness that is already here.
Here is what Ramana Maharshi asks of you, practically, today. First, ask the question once, genuinely. Not as a philosophical puzzle, not as an exercise in clever self-reflection, as Ramana asked it on the floor in Madurai, as a direct investigation into the nature of the one who is asking. Sit for 5 minutes, eyes closed or open, and ask. Not to the mind, not expecting the mind to answer.
Who is aware right now? Who is reading? Who is sitting? Can you find the I that you so easily assume without looking at it? Sit with the question, not the answer, the question. Let the inquiry itself be the practice, the turning of the attention toward its source, rather than always outward toward its contents. Second, notice the awareness between thoughts. Ramana pointed his students toward the gap, the space between one thought and the next, which is always present, which is the silence from which every thought arises and into which every thought dissolves, as the most accessible entry point into what the inquiry is pointing at. Once today, when the mind is running, when the thoughts are arising in their usual rapid sequence, look for the gap, the moment between one thought ending and the next beginning. Not the content of the gap, what is present in it, what is there when there is nothing there. Ramana said the self, the awareness, is most obvious in that gap, not because it is absent in the thoughts, because the thoughts, in their constant arising, draw the attention to themselves and away from the awareness that they are arising in. Third, hold the question when the performing begins. The self-inquiry practice for the householder who cannot sit in a cave on a holy mountain is available in the middle of the performance, not instead of the performance, in the middle of it. When you notice the performing, the self-monitoring, the impression management, the careful construction and maintenance of the identity that the social world requires, hold the question briefly. Who is performing? Can you find the one who is managing the impression? Or is there, behind the performer, an awareness that is simply watching, without requiring the performance to succeed? The inquiry does not dissolve the performing self. It changes the relationship to it, creates the distance, the spaciousness between the performing and the awareness of the performing that Ramana described as the beginning of freedom.
Fourth, sit in someone else's silence. Brunton found what he was looking for in Ramana's hall, not through Ramana's words, but through Ramana's presence, through the quality of stillness in a room where someone had spent 50 years resting in the awareness they were pointing at. Find a person or a place or a practice that has that quality, the friend who can sit with you in silence without the silence requiring filling, the walk that can be taken without the earbuds, the 10 minutes in the morning before the day has generated its noise, in which the awareness can be present to itself without being directed anywhere. Sit in it for long enough that the inner ease that Brunton described becomes, even briefly, even partially, recognizable. That is the practice. And what it is practicing, the awareness that rests in its own nature, that knows it has nowhere to go because it has never been anywhere else, is already here. I want to close with Ramana's response to the question that every student eventually asked him, the question that is, in some sense, the most important question available to a person who has been sitting with the inquiry for a while. A student asks, "I have been doing this practice for years. I have occasional glimpses of what you are pointing at, and then the ordinary mind returns, and the glimpses fade. How do I make it permanent?" Ramana says, "Who is asking?" Not dismissively, not as a deflection, as the precise, direct, completely genuine answer, because the one asking the question, the one who wants permanence, the one who is dissatisfied with the glimpses and wants something more stable, is the performing self, the identity that arose, not the awareness. The awareness does not need permanence. It does not need the glimpses to become permanent, because it was never the glimpse.
The glimpse was the moment when the performing self temporarily stilled, and the awareness that had been there all along was briefly noticed.
Who is asking? Look for the one who is asking. And notice, in the moment of genuine looking, that the one who is found is not the one who was asking. This is the whole of it. The one question, the one practice, the one discovery available to anyone in any circumstance, at any age, on any floor, in any room, that has no geography and no prerequisite except the willingness to look at what is already looking. Here is the question Ramana Maharshi leaves us with today. Not from the mountain, from the floor in Madurai, from the 16-year-old who lay still in the presence of the fear and asked, before he had any reason to think it would help, who is afraid? Right now, in the awareness that is receiving these words, who is reading? Can you find them? Can you locate the I that has been assuming itself so confidently without ever looking directly at what it is? Sit with that, just for a moment, not with the expectation of an answer, with the quality of attention that turns toward the turning. Who is asking? Who am I? Leave that in the comments, because that answer, your Ramana answer, found in the looking rather than the thinking, is not a small thing. It is the question, the only question, that has always been here, waiting for the asking to begin. I'll see you in the next one.